Thank you. Okay, Rabbi Sai. We're on the bottom of DAF Kuf Hey Amid Beis. We're a few lines. It's about 8 lines from the bottom. Amar Reb Yehuda Amar Rav. Kol hamis atzel behespedo shel chacham. Anyone who is lax in properly eulogizing a wise man, ro'i lekovro b'chayav. Such a person is worthy of being buried in their lifetime. Shenemar, as it says, vayikberu oso b'gavul nachalaso b'simna serach asher bahar Ephraim mitzafon lahar Ga'ash. In reference to the death of Yehoshua, the great Chacham, it says that they buried him in a certain area that was by Har Ephraim, and it was in the north of a place called Har Ga'ash. And usually when you have a landmark that is unfamiliar, Chazal say that this is a reference to something else. Melamed Sheragash Aleim Har Lahorgan. That the word Ga'ash means to tremble or to quake, and therefore what this means is that the mountain quaked as a looming threat, seeking to bury them because they had not properly eulogized Yehoshua. So you see from there that a person deserves to be buried alive if they don't properly eulogize a chacham. Amar Reb Chia bar Abba Amar Reb Yechanan Kol hamisatzel behespedo shel chacham eno marich yom mida keneged mida. That if a person is lax and is lackadaisical and does not properly eulogize a chacham, then he will not merit to have length of days. And so the Gemara says that this is mida keneged mida. This is measure for measure punishment. That because you did not give proper concern for the fact that this person died before he could have a longer life, you will not, also Hashem will not care for you to give you a long life in return. And Shenamar, and how do we know that Hashem punishes midah keneged midah, measure for measure? As it says, B'sasa'ah b'shalachatu rivena. As the pasuk says in Yeshaya, B'sasa'ah, from the word sa'ah, which means measurement, that Hashem sends out a measurement commensurate to what the person has done offensively. Eisvei Reb Chia bar Abba Reb Yechanan. So the challenge is, how can you tell me that the people who buried Yehoshua did not merit long life? It says in the pasuk later, Vayavdu ha'ames Hashem kol yemei Yehoshua, v'chol yemei hazikenim. This is a pasuk in Shoftim, that they served Hashem all the days of Yehoshua and the days of the elders asher harichu yamim acharei Yehoshua, who had long lives after Yehoshua. So you see that even the elders who buried Yehoshua merited long life, even though you've just said that they didn't properly eulogize him. So Amarlei Bavloi. So Rabbi Yochanan said back to Reb Chia bar Abba, who was a Babylonian, he said, come on, Babylonian guy, Yamim ha'erichu, shanim lo ha'erichu. They had good quality of life. That's what arichus yamim means. Arichus yamim means quality of life. But length of life, they did not have. So, Ela me'at l'man yirbu yameichem v'imei v'neichem yamim v'lo shanim? Question mark. The Gemara asks, so when the Torah says the blessing in Kriya Shema, in order that your days will be lengthened if you follow Hashem's commandments, you mean to tell me that that does not mean long life, it just means quality of life? The Gemara answers, bracha shain. No. When Hashem gives you a bracha, and He gives you a bracha that you should have arichus yamim, then the context indicates that Hashem is being extremely benevolent, and therefore not only is quality of life included, but also length of life as well. Not only quality, but quantity. But it's only when there's a narrative that talks about arichus yamim, then you can't adduce from there that it's a reference to quantity of life, but rather just quality of life. Next, that if one brother in a family dies, then all of the other brothers should be concerned because maybe there's a spiritual negative effect that's influencing the entire family, so they have to be concerned and they should do tshuva. So, and similarly, if a group of friends, if one of the group dies, so then all of the group should be concerned. And Amrila Demeis Gadol, Amrila Demeis Katan. Some say that that's only true when the eldest is probably not necessarily true here. It's when the greatest of the group, the most chashuv, the most important member of the group dies, that's a sign that Hashem is upset, and therefore He chooses the most righteous person to punish first, but everyone else should be concerned. Va'amri la demeis katan, and some say that it's either the youngest or the least distinguished dies, because sometimes the person with the least merit will be punished first, and then others will follow in suit. Okay, let us go on. V'chol hamekalkalin peturin, that anyone who does an act of kilkul on Shabbos, even in the course of doing a malacha, is patur, because kilkul means a destructive act, and therefore you're not chayiv. Tani Rabbi Avohu kamei de Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Avohu recited the following brisa in the presence of Rabbi Yochanan. Kol hamekalkalin peturin chutz michovel u'mavir. Anytime a person does a destructive act, he's patur from a malacha, except for chovel u'mavir, except when he is imposing an injury on someone, or when he's incinerating something. When he's chovel, which means he's causing someone to bleed, so that's a destructive act. And when you're burning something, that's also a destructive act. But nevertheless, you're going to be chayv if you do those two things. So Amar Lei, so Rabbi Yochanan said to Rabbi Avohu, Puk tani lebra, chovel u'mavir eina mishnah. So he says, go out, Rabbi Avohu, go out to the street and tell everyone that what you just taught from the Mishnah is incorrect. That is not true. There is no exception to the rule of mekalkel. All mekalkelin are patur, including chovel u'mavir. Ve'im timtzaloi mar Mishnah, chovel b'tzarech lekalbo, mavir b'tzarech le'efara. And if you're going to argue that chovel u'mavir are chayiv, then you have to say that we're not talking about a mekalkel. We're talking about a person who draws blood in order for a productive use of giving it to the blood to his dog, or a person who is burning something because he needs to harvest ash. And so those are constructive acts, not destructive acts, and as a result, that's the only time you'll be chai for doing those two malachas. But if you're doing completely destructive acts with no productive objective, so then just like by all other acts of makalkal you're patur, so too by here you're going to be patur. So 1 second, let's just hold on to the idea. Let's just go through the Shak Levitarya first. Then you can ask your questions when we're done. So now the Gemara asks the following question. V'ha anan tanan, but didn't we learn Rabbi Avohu? How could you even cite such a brisa which suggests that there's a makalkel that could be chayiv, such as chovel and mavir? V'ha anan tanan kol makalkel in peturin. Doesn't our Mishnah say that every time a person is destructive, he is patur, and it makes no exceptions, and therefore it's inclusive of chovel and mavir, of injuring and burning? So how can you say that those two are exceptions when the Mishnah says there are no exceptions? Answers the Gemara, Masnisan Rebbe Yehuda, Braisa Rebbe Shimon. So the Gemara gives an answer that's a little bit complex. So I need to explain it. Rebbe Yehuda and Rebbe Shimon basically have a machlokus on a couple of different areas having to do with Melecha Shabbos. And we've seen this idea before of a malacha she'ena tzricha legufa, that a malacha where the objective is not dealing with the normative objective of that malacha. So therefore, our Mishnah, which says that anytime you're makalkel, you're going to be patur, is according to Rebbe Yehuda. Rebbe Yehuda says that if I have a side objective that is not dealing with my subject at hand, but there's another objective, then that's called, you're going to be chayiv for doing that malacha. And therefore, that's no longer called makalkel according to Rebbe Yehuda. So if, for example, I go ahead and I draw blood from a person in order to give that blood, feed it to my dog, Rebbe Yehuda says that that's not called an act of makalkel. Because even though the objective is not for the subject at hand, I'm doing something destructive. But for a third party, I'm doing something constructive. Rebbe Yehuda still considers that to be a bona fide malacha with a positive objective, and therefore that's no longer called makalkel. So therefore, when our Mishnah says that anytime you're makalkel, you're patur, that's true. And that's why a person who draws blood for the sake of his dog is not a makalkel, so it's not a conflict. That's how Rebbe Avohu will tell you what our Mishnah means. Our Mishnah goes according to Rebbe Yehuda, who says that drawing blood for the sake of your dog is not called an act of mekalkel, and therefore it's not a contradiction. And the same thing is true with burning. If I'm burning something in order to harvest the ash from that burning, that's not called mekalkel, because even though the subject at hand, which is the wood, is being destroyed, but since there's a side objective, which is the harvesting of the ash, that's not called mekalkel anymore, according to Rabbi Yehuda. And therefore, that's why our Mishnah can say that all acts of mekalkel you're patur for, because Rabbi Yehuda does not consider that to be an act of mekalkel. Reb Shimon, however, does consider those acts to be acts of mekalkel. Reb Shimon says that as long as the subject at hand that you're currently working with is destroyed in the process of your doing the malacha, that's called an act of mekalkel. And therefore, the only way that Reb Shimon can suggest that for drawing blood and for burning you can be held liable is only because those are exceptions to the rule of mekalkel. And therefore, since for Reb Shimon those acts are by definition mekalkel, it must be that if you can be chayav for those things, then there are two things for which, even when you're mekalkel, you're going to be chayav. So now the Gemara says, my time at Reb Shimon. What's Reb Shimon's reasoning? In other words, how does Reb Shimon know that for these two things, even though you're mekalkel, you're still going to be chayav? And he answers, he says, Mid'ifterich kra l'mishra mila. He says, well, let's talk about chovel first. Chovel, which means drawing blood or injuring someone. He says, the very fact that the Torah permits me to do bris milah on Shabbos means that without that pasuk, I would think that I'm doing a malacha and that it's aser. The very fact that the Torah says bris milah is an exception to the general rule means that the general rule is that it's a malacha to injure an infant's body or any person's body on Shabbos. So you see therefore, hachovel ba'al machayev. So therefore you see that doing an act that's not the special mitzvah of bris milah is considered to be a malacha. You're doing an act of mekalkel by injuring the body. The answer is that this is an exception to the rule of mekalkel. And umida aser rachmana havara gabi bas kohen shmamina mavir ba'al machayev. And then what about the law of havara? What about the law of burning? So it's a little bit different over here. And this is not so clear in the Gemara, but you have to say this. The very fact that the Torah tells me that I'm not allowed to prepare lead by melting it in preparation of executing the daughter of a Kohen on Shabbos. I'm not allowed to execute the daughter of a Kohen, a Bas Kohen, on Shabbos. The halacha is that if a Bas Kohen commits adultery, even though the normal penalty for adultery is a lesser death penalty, but because of the status of her family, she dies through sreifa, she dies through incineration. Now, how do you fulfill the law of incineration when meting out the death penalty? You take lead and you melt it. You take molten lead and you pour it down the victim's throat, and that's how you practice execution through sreifa. Now, the Torah does not allow me, we learn this out in a Gemara elsewhere, that even though we might be able to sanction other forms of execution, on Shabbos we do not allow you to prepare molten lead in preparation of executing a Bas Kohen. And the fact of the matter is that because the preparation of the molten lead is just like any other act of sreifa or melting something on Shabbos, we learn from there that just like you're not allowed to prepare molten lead for a Bas Kohen on Shabbos, you're also not allowed to do any other kind of burning act on Shabbos. What about the fact that you're doing an act of mekalkel by melting something and reducing it from its normal state? The answer is that you see from here that even when you're burning and doing an act of kilkel, you're still doing a malacha in your chayiv. That's the way the Gemara wants to adduce it. The difference between the case of bris milah is that bris milah is the exception to the rule of chovel because you're doing mamish a mitzvah while you're doing the act of chavala. By the Bas Kohen, you're merely preparing molten lead in order to commit an act of execution, and the fact that the Torah prohibits that shows you that all acts of burning are aser.
Can the execution be on Shabbat? Is that the idea?
Can the execution be on Shabbos? The Gemara says no, but the reason why the execution cannot be on Shabbos is because you're not allowed to prepare the molten lead on Shabbos. Now, let's say, in theory, could you prepare the molten lead Erev Shabbos and then execute her on Shabbos, that I don't know. But the point that the Gemara is bringing out from over here is that you're not allowed to prepare, you're not allowed to burn lead on Shabbos, period. You're not allowed to melt lead on Shabbos. So now the Gemara says, the Rabbi Yehuda hasa misakinu. So Rabbi Yehuda says, you're adducing from these two cases that when you do an act of kilkul on Shabbos by chovel and mavir your chayiv is totally misplaced. Because in both of those cases, both by bris milah and by melting lead, you're not doing an act of kilkul to your subject. You're doing an act of tikkun. You're doing an act that is productive. Because misakinu, kid Ravashi, damar Ravashi, malu lisakin mila, malu lisakin kli. Ravashi says that circumcising an infant is tantamount to fixing a vessel. The human body is no different from any vessel that needs to be rectified. So therefore, that's not an act of kilkul, and therefore, the reason why the Torah has to tell you that only bris milah can be done because it's a mitzvah is because if it weren't in the course of a mitzvah, that would be considered to be a rectification of the body. And furthermore, mali lavashal psila, mali lavashal samanim. And the same thing is true by melting lead. Melting lead is not an act of kilkul. You're preparing lead for its desired use, which is to use as to provide heat to a subject. And so there's no difference between cooking lead and cooking herbs in order to get a desired result. That's constructive, that's not destructive. And therefore, says Rabbi Yehuda rather, these are not acts of kilkul, and therefore you can't derive from here that when you're makalkel by these two things, you're going to be chayiv. That's the end of that sugya. If you have any questions now, very briefly, please ask your question.
Would Rabbi Yehuda ever have a case of kilkul then? Because it seems like all his cases are not.
Yes, of course there can be a case of kilkul if there's no constructive outcome. Let's say I'm burning because I just don't want this wood here. I don't have any desired objective out of the wood other than I just don't want wood. I want to get rid of this wood. So I want to throw it away. So instead of throwing it away, I decide to burn it.
But you're getting space. You're getting space.
So maybe one could argue that you're getting space. If you can make that argument, perhaps Rabbi Yehuda would. It's a good point, Hi. It's a good point. But I would tell you that it depends. It depends on the person's objective. He just maybe says, no, I don't want wood anymore.
Or you can sell the ash.
But if that's not your objective, then it's not called a malacha. It's not called a tikkun, because that's not your desire. Remember, when it comes to malacha, it's got to be malaches machsheves. Your thoughts are taken into account in order to define whether something's a malacha or not. Okay, shir hamalabe. Then we saw that there has to be a certain minimal amount of fabric that you're going to do laundering or dyeing or untangling or spinning in order to be liable for that malacha on Shabbos. And we said it's the length of a seat. Now the question is, how much is a seat? So Rav Yoseph machvi kaful and Rav Chia bar Ami machvi pashut. We all agreed that it's based on the Rashi and the Mishnah that the length of a seat is from the index finger to the middle finger. Make a V for victory, and then you measure the top of the V, and that's the distance. The machlokus is it twice that length, or is it one time that length? And that's the machlokus. But whatever it is, you need that length of thread or fabric in order to be chayav for those malachas. A standard hand. Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Hatzad Sipor LeMigdal Utzvi Labayis Chayav. Rabbi Yehuda says, it's a valid question now, you just have to go on. Yeah. Rabbi Yehuda says, if a person traps a bird in a migdal is a special tower, a special kind of construct that is meant for trapping birds. And if you trap a bird in that very confining space, or if you trap a deer inside a house by coaxing the deer into the house and then closing the door, so then you've done an act of tzeda. This is a whole new different subject. It's the malacha of tzad. It's the malacha of trapping on Shabbos. And this is how you become chayav for the malacha of tzad, either for a bird or for an animal, for a deer. The Chachamim disagree. They say, tzipor lemigdal, we agree when it comes to a bird that you need to trap it in a tower. And utzvi, however, but when it comes to a deer, then lebayis, ulegina, ulechatzer, ulebiborin chayav. then it's not just to get it into the house, but even if you just get it into a garden, a private garden that's confined, or to a courtyard, or to a bibar. What is a bibar? A bibar is usually translated as a habitat, which could mean a number of different things. But in this context, a bibar for a chaya means a confined space that is a lot, like an empty piece of land, that is bounded by some kind of fencing, and the animal has the ability to roam about within this habitat, but once you bring it in there, you're chayiv. It's not as confining as a house, it's less confining, and that's why there's this machlokus between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda as to whether trapping it in a bibar or a chatzer is enough of a trapping to make you chayiv on Shabbos or not.
Why is there such an argument even?
We'll see. Wait for the Gemara. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Lo kol ha-biborin shavin. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, not all Biebers are the same. You got Justin Bieber, you got Leave It to Bieber, but yeah.
And you got the bar where the bees go to drink their honey.
That's right. And you got the Bieber. Right. Okay. So not all Biebers are the same. Not all Biebers are the same. So you've got some Biebers are Zehaklal, Mechusar Tzeda Potter, Sheina Mechusar Tzeda Chayev. That if the bibar is so large that the animal you need to still run after the animal in order to catch it in the habitat, so then you have not done an act of tzeda by getting it into this bibar. But if the bibar is so confined that you don't have to run after it once you've put it into this bibar, so then the act of putting into the bibar is a malacha of tzad, and therefore you're chayiv. Let's analyze this further by looking at the Gemara. So first, the Gemara brings us an entire sugya from Maseches Beitza, and here's the sugya. There's a Mishnah Maseches Beitza that says, Tanan Hasam, Ein Sadim Dagim in Habiborim Biyom Tov, Ve'einosin Lifnei Mizonos, that you're not allowed to trap fish from a bibar on Yom Tov. Now, a fish bibar, a fish habitat, is clearly not an empty lot that's bounded by fencing. That's not where fish live. Fish live in a pond. So a fish bibar is a pond, okay? So if I have a closed pond, I'm not allowed to trap fish from there. Why? Because you still have to do some form of trapping even after they've already been confined in the pond. And because of that, the fish are muktzah, and therefore you're not allowed to feed them on Yontif because you're not allowed to feed an animal that has the din of muktzah, okay? Avol tzadin chayev va'ov, V'nosin lifnei mizonos. But if you have a wild animal like a deer, or an oaf, or a bird, so then those animals, those creatures, if you find them in a habitat, they're duly confined, and therefore you're allowed to take them out of the habitat for shechita, because they've already been trapped. You're not trapping them further, and they're non-muktzah, so you're allowed to feed them on yontif. So now the Gemara in Beitza now says, or minu. Let's raise a contradiction to that Mishnah in Beya from a Brisa. What does the Brisa say? Biborin shel chayos v'shel ofos v'shel dagim ein tzadin mehem biyom tov ve'inoslem v'fnei mizonos. So it says according to this Brisa, there is no differentiation between fish and other creatures. All creatures, fish, animals, and birds, none of them may be harvested from a bibar on Yontif because they all involve trapping, and therefore you're not allowed to feed them as well. So kasha chaya achaya, kasha ofos ha'ofos. So this is a contradiction for animals, it's a contradiction for birds, because the Mishnah in Beya says that you are allowed to take the birds and the animals out of the bibar because they're already trapped. And this Brisa says that no, you're not, because they're not trapped yet. So Bishlam achaya achaya lo kasha hareb Yehuda harabana. So one way we can answer the animal contradiction, because we have our Mishnah here that says our Mishnah here in Shabbos brings a machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim that when you trap an animal in a bibar, have you trapped the animal or not? Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you haven't yet trapped the animal, and therefore you're putter, and therefore if the animal is in a bibar, it would be asur on yontif for you to trap it, because then your mom is trapping it now for the first time. But according to the Rabbanan, who say that when you bring an animal into a bibar, it's already trapped, so then it's mutter to take it out of the bibar on yontif because it's already trapped, right? So that would answer that contradiction. Ela ofos, ofos kasha. But that won't help the contradiction for birds. Because in our Mishnah, both according to Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, a bird is not considered trapped until it's inside that migdal, until it's inside that very confining tower. But if it's in a bibar, if it's just in a habitat for birds, what do they call that? An aviary? An aviary?
Aviary is for the like a zoo for birds.
Like a zoo for birds. But if it's just in like that bird bibar, so then that's not considered to be trapped, neither according to Rabbi Yehuda nor according to the Chachamim. So how can the Mishnah say that? So we have this contradiction, which we don't seem to have an apparent solution for. So maybe I'll give you an answer. I'll tell you, you know what? For birds, it's not a contradiction. When are you allowed to take a bird out of its aviary? Is when the aviary has a roof over it, and therefore the bird is considered to be trapped. And when is it usher to take it out on Yantif? When the aviary does not have a roof over it, in which case the bird is still considered to be in the wild. And therefore it's usher to take it on Yantif, because then you'd be trapping it now for the first time. Frek the Gemara, v'habayis de makurahu, ubein l'Rebbe Yehuda, ubein l'Rabbanan, sipor l'migdal in l'bayis lo. The Gemara says you can't say that though. Because when you look at our Mishnah, you see that even trapping a bird in a house is not considered trapping it. The bird is not trapped. Because in a house, a bird flies all over the place. Do you ever get a bird fly into your house?
Yeah.
It's very inconvenient. No, chas v'shalom, birds are great.
No, but it's supposed to be bad luck if it goes.
Who told you that?
Bad luck.
Some go.
Not our
That's not.
Vulture goes. Some go. There you go.
Yeah.
Not our tradition.
Yeah. Right. I don't know. It sounds. I've always heard the Baba Maisa that if a bird poops on you, that's good.
The blue bird of happiness.
Right. That's a good. That's
a bank. A good deposit.
That's a good mazel. Anyway, so but the point is that a bird in the house, it flies all over the place. It's very hard to trap. So how can you tell me that a roofed aviary is considered to be trapped? If the bird in a house is not trapped, then surely a roofed aviary is not a trap. Uvein l'Rabbanan sipur l'migdal in l'bayis lo. It's got to be dafka in this migdal. I don't know how they translate it in your art scroll, but it's this tower that is very confining where the bird mamish can't move.
A closet.
A closet. Only then do we say that it's trapped, but not in any other scenario. So Amar Rabba Barafuna hacha b'tzipor dror askina lefi she'ena mekabeles marus. The answer is that no. Really, you could say the distinction between the Mishnah in Beitza and the Brisa in Beitza is that we're talking about two different bibars. One is a roofed habitat, and the other one is an unroofed habitat. What about the fact that our Mishnah says that a bird, even in a roofed habitat, is not considered trapped? The answer is we're talking about two different birds, right? The sugya in Beitza is talking about birds that accept domestication, that once they're trapped and inside a roofed area, they become docile and very easy to work with. But our Mishnah is talking about birds of the wild that even when they fly into a house, they're completely uncontrollable. And therefore, you're still putter if you trap them like that on Shabbos to bring them into the house, because they're still flying all over the place, and it's very difficult to apprehend them. So, the Tana Devei Rabbi Shmuel, Lama Nikra Shema Tzipor Deror. Why is the bird of the wild called a Tzipor Deror? What does the word Deror mean? Because it is just as wild and uncontrollable inside a house as it is out in the field. And therefore, that's why our Mishnah says the only time you're doing an act of tzed is if you trap it in that tower, that confining tower, whereas over here, over there in Maseches Beitza, it's talking about a bird that is more easily domesticated, and therefore it depends. If it's in a roofed bibar, so then it's already considered to be trapped, and therefore you could take it on Yantif and Shechted. If it's in an unroofed bibar, so then it's considered to be untrapped, and therefore it's muktzah and you can't use it. So the Gemara now says, Hashta da asis lahachi chaya nami lokasha haba bibar gadol haba bibar kata. Now that you've given me this answer that there are different kinds of bibars to explain the contradiction by birds, you can also use the same answer to explain the contradiction by animals. And instead of saying that one's Rabbi Yehuda and one's the Rabbanan, no. You could say they're all according to the Chachamim, but we're talking about two different bibars. One big bibar and one little bibar. In other words, there's certain confined areas where an animal is considered to be totally trapped, and therefore it's considered to be non-muktzah, you can use it on Yontiv. And there are other kinds of habitats which are more open, and therefore, just because it's in the habitat, you still have to run around for a long time before you actually trap it. So now the Gemara says, Heichi dami biber gadol, heichi dami biber katan. So what's a big biber and what's a small biber? Amar of Ashi, kol heicha derohit basrei umoti lo bechad shichaya biber katan. The idach biber gadol. It says, if the habitat is so confined that by just walking in and making one motion to grab the animal, you can catch it, so that's called a biber katan. That's a small biber, and therefore the animal is considered trapped. But if the habitat is larger than that, so that you need to make a couple of attempts, you can't just get it in one attempt, so that's called a biber gadol. The animal is not considered to be trapped, and therefore it's muktzah, and you cannot use it on yontif. Inami, kol heicha denafil tula dekasala mahadadi, biber katan, v'idach biber gadol. Another explanation is the distinction between a large biber and a small biber, is if the shadow of one wall casts on the opposite wall, that's a sign that it's a small biber. And if not, then it's a biber gadol. And finally, the final distinction is v'inami kol heicha deleka ukzi biber katan v'idach biber gadol. If the habitat does not have crevices and corners where the animal can retreat and hide and elude your arm, so then that's called a biber katan because it doesn't have those places where it can hide. But if it has those crevices and corners where it can retreat to, so that's called a biber gadol. Yes, hi.
We're supposed to be looking at what kind of trapping there was, what kind of hunting there was in the Mishkan. So what happened in the Mishkan?
In the Mishkan, they had to trap animals in order to harvest their hides. So that's why we know that Seder is one of the 39 malachos.
Right. So what kind of?
Well, they had to trap the animals out in the wild. So any act of trapping is considered to be a malacha.
Yeah, man. Then we should be looking. I know we probably can't as to where did they put them? A small beaver, a big beaver, Like.
No. The act of trapping was going out into the wild and catching the animals in the first place.
Right.
Storing the animal, then we have to find out, is the storage of the animals create no longer an act of tzeda or not? At what stage is the animal considered trapped? Right? Okay, Rav Shimon Gamliel Omer v'chulei. Rav Shimon Gamliel says that it all depends the size of the biber to determine whether you've done a malacha or not by trapping it on Shabbos. If it's a biber gadol, it's not trapped, and if it's a biber katan, it is trapped. And his criterion is that if the animal still needs to be pursued after it's placed in the bibar, it's not considered to be trapped. So the Gemara says, Amar of Yoseph, Amar of Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Halacha Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. That's the halacha. We paskin like Rav Shimon ben Gamliel that you look at the size of the bibar to determine whether the animal is trapped or not. So Amar le Abaya halacha michlal de pligi. So Abaya says, I don't understand the language that you just used, Rav Yosef. You say we paskin like Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, which implies that the Chachamim disagree with him. You mean to suggest that the Chachamim would hold that if you put an animal in such a large bibar that you still have to run after it, it's still considered to be trapped? That doesn't make any sense. So Amar le, my nafgalach mina. So Rav Yosef says to Abai, what do you care if the Chachamim disagree with Rav Shimon Gamliel or not? I'm just telling you that the halacha, as far as how we practice, like Rav Shimon Gamliel. So forget about the Chachamim because we don't paskin like them anyway. So Amar le, Gemara is the Gemara to hey. So Abai says, Rebbe, I'm surprised that you can respond to me this way. We have to understand Mishnah and not make it like a song, like a sing-song. We're not supposed to learn Mishnah so that we can memorize it and regurgitate it at a Pirchei contest. We're supposed to understand the Mishnah, and we have to understand who says what and who says what. And if there's a machlokas, then there's a machlokas, and if there's not a machlokas, it's not a machlokas. But clarify it for me. So Tana Rabbana, next braysa, Hatzad sevi suma v'yashen chayev chiger v'zakin chayla pater. That if a person traps a deer that is blind or sleeping on Shabbos, even though the animal currently is stationary, you've still done it, and you throw a net over it, you've still done an act of tzad. But if you throw a net over a handicapped deer, an elderly deer that's chalished and it can't move anymore, or a sickly deer, so then you have not done an act of tzeda. So Amar le Abayla of Yosef, Maishna Hani or Maishna Hani. What's the difference? So the answer, he told him, Hani avidi l'ribuye, Hani lo avidi l'ribuye. The answer is quite simple. An animal that's sleeping or is blind, the reason why it's stationary is because right now it's stationary, but if you were to jostle it and it were to know that it's about to be trapped, it would bolt and it would dart and it would run away. And so therefore, you're actually trapping an animal that is elusive. Just so happens that you got it at a time when it's vulnerable. But when you're trapping an animal that mamish can't move because it's debilitated, then you're not trapping an animal that normally darts and is elusive. So the Gemara now says, "V'hatanya chol chayiv." But isn't there a brisa that says that even a sickly deer, if you trap it on Shabbos, you're chayiv? So how can you say that you're pater? Amar Rav Sheshes lo kasha habechola machmas ishta habechola machmas uvtzina. There are two types of sickness. One is a sickness that is a result of fever, where the animal still has the power of propulsion and it could still potentially be elusive. And then if you trap it, you're chayiv. But if an animal has a sickness that causes it to be completely sedentary and can't move anymore, so then you're not chayiv because the animal can't move. Tanu Rabbanan, Hatzad Chagovim Gezim Tzirin V'Yitushin B'Shabbos Chayv Divrei Reb Meir. Reb Meir holds that if you trap different kinds of insects, Chagovin and Gezim are two different species of grasshopper. They're both edible. Tzirin are wasps. Yitushin are mosquitoes. In all of those cases, you're going to be chayav for trapping on Shabbos. And the Chachamim omrim, kol shebemino nitzod chayav, v'chol she'en bemino nitzod pater. The Chachamim say we disagree. Only things that are trapped because you want the animal or the creature are you chayav for trapping on Shabbos. So therefore, when it comes to edible grasshoppers, if you trap them on Shabbos, we agree with you, Rabbi Meir, you're chayav, because those are animals that you want to use, you want to keep for food. But if you trap a mosquito or you trap a wasp, the reason why you're trapping it is not because you want the wasp, it's because you want it to keep it away from yourself. That's not the classic Seder of Shabbos, and therefore you're going to be potter. By the way, we paskin like that, and therefore, even though it's still an Isser D'Rabbanan to trap a mosquito or a wasp on Shabbos, it's an Isser D'Rabbanan, but it's not an Isser D'Oraisa. And there are ramifications. If, let's say, a bee comes into the house, and you're scared that it's going to sting you, or it comes into the sukkah and you're scared it's going to sting you. Many poskim are liberal and they say that you can trap it on Shabbos, not kill it, but you can trap it on Shabbos because since it's only an Isser D'Rabbanan to begin with, and it's an Isser D'Rabbanan that's accompanied with a danger that you may get stung, then you can be lenient and you can trap it. Tanya Idach, we have another brisa which says, Hatzad Chagovim Bishas Hatal Potter Bishas Hashrav Chayiv. That if a person traps grasshoppers when the dew is outside, meaning that it's a little bit cool outside, so by trapping grasshoppers when there's dew, the Rashi says the dew blinds the grasshoppers because it gets in their eyes, and as a result they can't move properly. So by trapping them, you haven't done an act of trapping because a grasshopper at that stage is not elusive, and therefore you're putter. But if you trap a grasshopper when it's in the dry season, and therefore it can really hop around a lot, so then you're chayiv, you've done the malacha. Elazar ben Mahavai Omer im hayu mikalchos ubaos pater. And on that, Elazar ben Mahavai says that if the grasshoppers are coming at you in a swarm, so then you're going to be pater. Why? Because when they come at you at a swarm, it's so easy to trap them. They're not elusive at that point because you just hold up a jar or a basket and they just fly in. So they're not really elusive creatures where you're doing an act of trapping. So Ibayaluhu, Elazar ben Mahavai, Aresha Koi o Asefa Koi. So the question is he being more machmir or is he being more makel? So in other words, is he coming to tell me that even during the time when grasshoppers are blind, that you can only trap them when they're swarming, so he's being machmir? Or is he coming to tell me that no, in the dry season, when we say that you're doing a malacha of tzad, that's only true when they're not swarming, but when they're swarming, it's okay. So Tashma Hatzad Chagavim Bishas Hatal Potter Bishas Hashrav Chayiv Elazar ben Mahavai Omer Afilu Bishas Hashravim Hoyi Mekalchos Ubaos Potter. So it's clear from this brisa that Elazar ben Mahavai is coming to be makel, and he's coming to say that even though the Chachamim hold that during the dry season you're always chayiv if you trap grasshoppers, I qualify that, and he says no, you'll be potter if they're coming to you in a swarm fashion. Because then, even though they're hopping around a lot and it's the dry season, but because they're not elusive at that stage when they're in a swarm, so then you're going to be potter. Next Mishnah, very quickly, Tzvi shenichnas labayis v'nol echad b'fanav chayev na'alu shnayim peturim. That if a deer walks into the house, sounds like deer walks into a bar, sounds like a joke, right? But if you go ahead and you lock the door behind the deer, so then you've done a malacha of tzad and you're chayiv. If, however, two people close the door, so then, like we learned before, when two people do a malacha, so then both of them are pater. Lo yachal echad lino v'nalu shnayim chayavin. But if the lock is so heavy that you need two people to lock it, so then they're both going to be chayiv. And on that, Reb Shimon says you're poter. Reb Shimon, remember, several pages ago, we learned that according to Reb Shimon, even when you need two people to do a malacha, the only time the Torah holds you chayiv is if you do a malacha by yourself, because of the word ba'asosah in the pasuk, that if one person does it, bim nefesh achas, it's got to be one person doing it, and therefore you're going to be poter. Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Shmuel, Hatzad Ari b'Shabbos eno chayiv ad she'achnisenu legurzaki shalo. Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba says, in the name of Shmuel, that if you trap a lion on Shabbos, you know how you do that? Very carefully. If you trap a lion on Shabbos, you're only chayiv if you actually get it into its cage. Why? Because before you get it into its cage, it's not really considered trapped. So just be careful the next time you try trapping a lion. Next, the Mishnah says, Yashav ha'echad al ha'pesach v'lo mil'ehu. Yashav ha'sheni mil'ehu, ha'sheni chayiv. If you've got a doorway, the deer has walked into the house, and then a guy goes ahead and he sits in the aperture of the doorway. But his girth is not wide enough to completely cover the doorway, and so therefore the deer could still walk past him and get out. So he has not done the malacha of trapping. But if the second guy sits down next to him and his girth completes the enclosure, so then it's the second guy who's chayev and not the first guy. Next, Yoshev harishon ala pesach umil'ehu, ba'asheni v'yoshev b'tzido, afal pi shamar harishon v'holach lo harishon chayev hasheni poter. The next case is that if you have a situation where you have the first guy, Ruvain, sits down in front of the door and his girth completely blocks the doorway, and then Shimon sits next to him, like in front of him, and so he's not doing any additional blocking of the doorway, so then only Ruvain is chayiv in that case because he's trapped the deer, and Shimon is not. And therefore, even if Ruvain were to stand up afterwards, so that Shimon is the only person blocking the door, since the deer had already been trapped when Ruvain sat down, Shimon will not be chayiv at all. Shimon is poter. It's analogous to a person who locks his door after discovering that the deer had already been trapped in his house. Meaning that by doing an extra act of trapping, once the animal has been trapped, you're not doing the malacha of tzad. And therefore, by Shimon sitting down in front of Ruvain, since Ruvain trapped the animal already by covering the doorway, Shimon is not going to be chayiv at all. Have a wonderful day.